On September 5, 2021, the haunted mine drop at Glenwood Caverns Adventure Park was operating normally. At around 7:10 p.m., a 6-year-old rider was loaded along with 5 other riders into the drop tower, which started at the top and dropped into an underground shaft. The ride operators checked the restraints of all riders, including the involved rider, who is sitting on top of their seatbelt with the tails of the seatbelt over their lap, and tried to start the ride. The ride would not start as the restraint the rider was sitting on had not been cycled from the previous ride cycle. After some troubleshooting, the ride operators removed the restraint from the block and reinserted it. The restraint now showed as cycled and the ride was started. The involved rider, not secured under a seatbelt, fell to the bottom of the ride and was killed. The investigation into the accident would span several organizations, and the final details of which would take years to be released. The ride was inspected after the accident by the Colorado Division of Oil and Public Safety. They produced a report that was used for my original video on this accident. However, since then, far more information has surfaced that sheds even greater light on this accident. We will be examining several sources, including CCTV footage from the accident, operator training and documentation at Glenwood Caverns, the training material provided by Soaring Eagle in the Operation and Maintenance Manual or O&M, the design of the ride itself, past incidents, and human factors. We'll move through all of these to reconstruct the web of failures that ultimately resulted in a 6-year-old being killed by an amusement ride. The ride had been manufactured by Soaring Eagle, now owned by Altitude Attractions, and opened at the park in 2017. The ride was an indoor underground drop tower that was loaded at the top of a 110-foot shaft. The ride building was broken up into several rooms: the queue room, the ride room, the control booth, and the exit hallway. The ride room housed the ride itself and featured a retractable floor to allow for loading and unloading. Due to the fall hazard presented by the open floor, the doors from the queue room, control room, and exit hallway were locked and monitored by the ride's control system, with the ride not able to start unless those were secure. Due to the ride's design, the control room was behind the ride and did not have a direct view of the ride itself. As a result, it featured a camera system giving operators a view of the ride and queue room located on a screen inside of the operator booth. The ride unit had 6 seats, each featuring 2 non-retractable seatbelts. The ride featured only seatbelts as both a primary and secondary restraint. These were 52-inch long, non-retractable black seatbelts that were very similar to the seatbelts used on other rides produced by Soaring Eagle. The first seatbelt on the ride was very similar to one that might be found on an average automobile. It was not monitored by the ride's control system and could be unlocked by the rider at any time. This was considered the ride's secondary restraint. The second seatbelt was the same length as the first, but it featured a grooved pin with ridges known as knuckles that would lock into a restraint block located near the other seatbelt buckle. Both seatbelts used all black webbing and locked into place several inches below each seat. The grooved pin attached to the second seatbelt would interlock with a device known as a restraint block. The restraint block featured a pneumatically actuated latch that would engage with grooves on the restraint pin. When the latch was in the horizontal position, it was unlocked and the pin could be removed. When it was in the diagonal position, it was locked as the latch would engage with the grooves on the restraint pin, holding it in place. Each restraint block also featured 2 proximity sensors that were connected to the ride's control system. One checked for the presence of the pin in the block, and the other monitored the position of the latch. Both of these sensors had to be activated on every restraint block in order for the ride to start. The ride also featured a restraint cycled feature. This required that each sensor change state after the conclusion of a ride cycle before another ride cycle could be started. This would mean that each restraint had to be unlocked and each pin be removed, reinserted, and then locked again in order for the ride to start. The ride was designed to unlock all restraints at the conclusion of a ride cycle for 30 seconds, though the restraint pins would remain in place unless removed by a person. After this, all restraints would relock regardless of if they had been removed from the block and could only be unlocked again by the use of a selector switch in the control room. The ride featured 6 seats that were not labeled, though each seat was displayed separately on the ride's control panel HMI screen. This control panel HMI screen showed the status of all restraint pins and restraint latches in real time, as well as if they had been cycled. The indicator would be red if the sensor was not sensing anything or if a restraint pin had not been cycled, and would be green if the restraint had been cycled or if the pin or latch was being sensed. The ride was designed to operate with between 1 and 2 operators. At the time of the accident, it was only using 1. During a normal ride cycle, the operator would go to the door of the queue room and allow up to 6 riders into the ride room. They would screen these riders and have them place loose articles in bins located in front of the ride. Riders would then sit down in one of the 6 seats. The ride's O&M manual provided by Soaring Eagle stated to, quote, pull the seatbelt over the passenger and insert the rod into the restraint block. Then gently tighten the seatbelt against the passenger. Repeat this step for each of the passengers. End quote. The Glenwood Caverns SOP also featured a statement similar to this. However, it was very common for riders to manage to successfully place their own seatbelts over their lap and secure it properly. The operator would then go to each seat and ensure that both seatbelts were secured into their receiver and that the belt was tight. The manual provided by Soaring Eagle, as well as the one given to operators by Glenwood Caverns, also stated for operators to visually check to confirm that riders had a seatbelt over their lap. After checking all seats, the operator would return to the operator booth, close and lock the doors from the queue room, exit hallway, and operator booth, then dispatch the ride. The retractable floor would open and the ride unit would detach from the catch car, falling 110 feet before being slowed by eddy current magnetic brakes. The catch car would then return to the bottom of the shaft to retrieve the ride unit. Once back at the top, the floor would close and all belts would unlock for 30 seconds. Riders then had to remove their belts or be assisted by an operator in removing their belts before they could exit the ride. There was no procedure in place in the O&M manual provided by Soaring Eagle or in the Glenwood Caverns operating document used to train operators regarding the clearing of seatbelts from the empty seats at the conclusion of a ride cycle, though some operators had taken to the practice of clearing the seatbelts and allowing them to hang in front of the ride unit after each ride cycle. But again, this was not documented anywhere as standard practice. Within the amusement industry, in areas that mandate compliance with ASTM F770, such as Colorado, ride owners are required to write operating documents that are then given to ride operators that explain how to properly operate a ride. These operating documents are often called Standard Operating Procedures or SOPs, and are written using information provided by the ride's manufacturer, as well as other park policies and best practices. We will not be covering the full extent of the manufacturer's O&M manual or the Glenwood Caverns SOP in this video, but both are linked below if you would like to learn more. A few key takeaways from the documents are as follows. The Glenwood Caverns Operator SOP was only 3 pages long, lacking details about several parts about how the ride worked. Most notably, there was no explanation of how the restraint cycled indicators on the control panel HMI screen worked, or what information they were displaying. The O&M manual did contain information about what exactly the restraint cycled indicator was showing. However, neither manual made any mention of the possibility of a rider sitting on top of a buckled seatbelt. It has been widely reported that the ride had an error or fault prior to the start of the accident cycle that the ride operators then overrode, resulting in the accident. This is not true. Instead, the restraint cycled indicator light for the involved rider's seat was showing red. The operators eventually resolved this by unlocking and removing the pin from the rider's restraint block, then locking and reinserting it. This did not require overriding the system or clearing a fault. The Glenwood Caverns SOP did have a section on what to do in case of a fault, but this was not relevant to this accident as a fault was not generated from this condition. Human factors refers to the study of how people intuitively interact with systems, environments, and technology. There were several human factors at play in this accident that all contributed to everything going just wrong enough that an accident occurred. One such factor that contributed to the accident was the lack of standard terminology in the ride's O&M manual, SOP, and in the terms used by staff at the park. The state investigators found that different parts of the ride, such as the restraint pins and indicator lights on the HMI screen, were referred to by different names by the staff at the park, the Glenwood Caverns SOP, and by altitude attractions. This can cause confusion and result in lack of understanding when an issue occurs. Another human factor was the design of the ride's restraint locking mechanism, which was prone to something known as the common restraint condition. In this condition, the latch would not fully seat into the grooves of the restraint pin and would get caught on the grooves of the knuckle. This would result in the pin feeling like it was secure, but as the latch was not fully in place, the proximity sensor would not be flagged, and this would result in a red indicator light for the corresponding seat on the latch section of the HMI screen. This could usually be resolved by pushing and pulling on the restraint pin to get it to fully seat into the latch. In some cases, the pin would be so hung up that this did not resolve the problem. In these cases, operators could resolve the issue by unlocking all restraints and removing the pin from the restraint blocks, then relocking them and reinserting the pins. This would usually allow the latch to fully seat into place and resolve the red indicator light on the HMI screen. This kind of problem is generally referred to as a nuisance problem in the amusement industry. It, on its own, has no direct harmful or dangerous effect on the ride, but it had the unintended consequence of conditioning the ride operators to fix red restraint indicator lights by following this process. The documented training for the operators in the SOP only mentioned that the ride would not start unless all of the restraint sensors were showing that all seatbelts were locked. Adding to the confusion, there was no documented training with regards to the restraint cycled section of the HMI screen. Neither the O&M manual or the SOP made any mention of the possibility that a red indicator could also suggest that a rider may be sitting on top of a seatbelt. Another human factor is the black webbing and long tail of the seatbelts. This, combined with the fact that the involved rider was wearing all black, made it very difficult to clearly visually verify the position of the rider's seatbelt over their lap as the operators were trained to do. The design of the seatbelts posed other issues as well, including that when fully tightened, each seatbelt could have around 36 inches of black tail webbing. This would give the illusion of a rider wearing a seatbelt if placed over a rider's lap. Oddly, Soaring Eagle did not provide the ride with the option of brightly colored seatbelts, despite this being a de facto standard in the industry at the time of this ride's construction. The events of this accident were not an isolated incident, as in 2019 a rider wrote to Glenwood Caverns after riding the mine drop, stating that they had sat on top of their seatbelt and tried to alert the operator. The operator initially gave the rider pushback before eventually unlocking all seatbelts and securing them properly over the rider's lap. This email was dated August 15, 2019 and was not discovered until after the accident, when the rider involved in this case contacted the state investigators. The general manager of Glenwood Caverns stated that this email was sent to an inbox that also saw all of their e-commerce orders. As a result, it was missed and never read by any staff at the park until after the accident. Another human factor was the placement of the ride's seatbelt receivers. These were located over 4 inches below the bottom of the seat. This meant that a seatbelt that was being sat on would not look significantly different at the block than one that was going over a rider properly. The ride had been manufactured by Soaring Eagle in 2017. Soaring Eagle had been founded by Stan Checketts, who is probably best known for founding the company S&S prior to leaving and starting Soaring Eagle. Soaring Eagle has since been dissolved and essentially operates under the name Altitude Attractions. Though technically they are not the same company, Altitude retains nearly all of Soaring Eagle's intellectual property and much of their talent. Soaring Eagle got their start producing zipline rides before expanding into other rides such as drop towers. With some modifications, their rides mainly all use the same restraint system, that being a non-retractable black or black and blue seatbelt that attaches to the restraint block described earlier in this video, as well as a second unmonitored seatbelt. Their zipline rides were the first to use this system, though they placed the block behind the seat rather than below it. Glenwood Caverns had one of these rides, as did several other parks and family entertainment centers. On May 29, 2015, a Soaring Eagle zipline operating at Rushmore Cave in South Dakota experienced an accident that resulted in a rider being ejected from the ride. The accident will get its own video in the future, and you can read the full accident report in the description now. For this video, we will just be explaining the basics. The ride had been operating normally when a rider who was riding alone boarded the ride. The operator loaded the rider into the ride unit as normal, secured the seatbelts to the restraint block, and started the ride. The rider, who was again wearing all black, was seated on top of the buckled seatbelt. When the ride reached the bottom of its run and decelerated, the rider was thrown from the ride and fell approximately 15 feet. The accident report made several statements about the design of the ride that contributed directly to the accident. Firstly, they found no evidence that Soaring Eagle performed a failure analysis as required by ASTM F2291, which sets baseline standards for the design of amusement rides. Additionally, the investigators, who in this case were engineers, made recommendations to the design of the ride that could prevent future accidents. These being to add automatically retracting seatbelts, a relocated location for the restraint block closer to the rider's hip, and adding brightly colored seatbelt webbing. These findings were sent to Soaring Eagle in 2016, a full year before Haunted Mine Drop ever opened. Not only did Soaring Eagle fail to make any changes to the design of their new rides, they also failed to notify owners of existing rides of this accident or the recommended changes, a violation of ASTM 1193. Prior to the report from Rushmore Cave being released, another accident on a Soaring Eagle zipline ride at Bullwinkle's Family Entertainment Center in Wilsonville, Oregon, occurred later on in 2015. No accident report was released for this one, as the rider's injuries were thankfully very minor. However, in this case, a rider was once again ejected from a Soaring Eagle ride due to sitting on top of a seatbelt. Neither of these two cases caused Soaring Eagle to modify the design of the restraints on their rides, or to notify owners of their rides that these had occurred. When Haunted Mine Drop was delivered to Glenwood Caverns in 2017, it featured gray and black non-retractable seatbelts, with no mention in the manufacturer's manual of the possibility of a rider sitting on top of a buckled seatbelt. Within approximately a year of the ride opening, the park ordered replacement seatbelts for the ride and received all black ones from Soaring Eagle. When CCTV footage of the accident was reviewed, several things could be noticed. Firstly, Operator 1 was working the ride. They had been at the ride sending a rest break for Operator 2, who was the operator scheduled at the ride that evening. On the ride cycle prior to the accident, seat number 3 was empty. Operator 1 inserted the seatbelts into their receivers as normal and tightened the belts as instructed to do so in the manufacturer's O&M and Glenwood Caverns SOP. This cycle was dispatched and operated normally. At the end of this cycle, the restraints automatically unlocked for 30 seconds and the 5 riders exited as the operator went to the door to load the next group of riders. Operator 1 did not remove the pins or seatbelt from seat number 3, as there was no training in either manual regarding this process. Later in the accident cycle, Operator 1 could be seen returning to the ride unit several times, as the red 3P restraint cycled indicator light was still illuminated, each time returning to the ride unit and pushing and pulling on the restraint pins as if they were trying to resolve the common restraint condition. Later on in the accident cycle, Operator 2 could be seen to return from their rest break, unlock all restraints, and then remove all restraints from the restraint block and reinsert them. It was after this that Operator 2 started the ride cycle that ultimately ended with the accident. Throughout the CCTV footage of the accident, the rider involved, who was 6 years old, could be seen placing the 36-inch tails of the seatbelts over their lap, likely as they were trying to secure their own seatbelt. This had the unintended consequence of adding to the confusion of the operators, whose focused attention was already on the restraint block rather than on the seatbelt itself. Both manuals did make mention of visually ensuring that riders had seatbelts over their laps. The investigators were able to retrieve the on-ride photo from the accident cycle, taken a few inches into the fall. This photo shows a very similar view to what the operators would have seen when visually verifying the rider's seatbelts just before the accident occurred. With all of this information uncovered, we can now reconstruct the accident. On September 5th, 2021, at around 7:10 p.m., Haunted Mine Drop was operating normally. Operator 1 had been in position at Haunted Mine Drop for approximately 10 minutes, providing a rest break to Operator 2, who was the scheduled operator for the ride that evening. The ride cycle prior to the accident only had 5 riders, leaving seat number 3 empty with both seatbelts fastened. Operator 1 verified all seatbelts were secured, including on the empty seat number 3. Operator 1 pulled out all slack from both seatbelts on seat number 3. This cycle was dispatched and operated as normal. At the conclusion of the cycle, the ride's control system automatically unlocked all restraints for 30 seconds. The operator directed the 5 departing riders from the cycle to exit as normal. As the previous group of 5 riders exited the room, the ride operator opened the door from the queue room to admit the next group into the ride room. The next group had 10 riders, and they attempted to enter the ride room together, causing some confusion for the operator as they explained there were only 6 seats. The first 6 members of the group were admitted, including the involved rider, who was a 6-year-old child, and began to take their seats. Once the capacity situation was explained, the remaining 4 members of the group returned to the queue room. By the time the group was admitted, the automatic 30-second restraint unlock period had expired, and the restraint pins had all relocked. The seatbelts for seat number 3 were still buckled, locked, and tightened from the previous ride cycle. The involved rider went to seat number 3 and pulled on the seatbelts, but could not remove them as they were locked due to the 30-second auto relock. The involved rider then sat down on top of the buckled seatbelts and put the approximately 36-inch lengths of tail over their lap, giving the appearance of wearing the seatbelts. This false appearance of wearing the seatbelts was further exacerbated by the fact that the involved rider was wearing black pants and a black shirt, which matched the color of the seatbelt webbing. By the time Operator 1 returned to the ride unit after directing the 4 extra members of the group, all 6 riders had seated themselves and were in the process of securing or attempting to secure their seatbelts. Operator 1 started checking restraints by physically verifying the security of both the seatbelt and the monitored pin on each restraint. When Operator 1 reached the involved rider's seat, the involved rider had the tails of their seatbelt over their lap. According to Operator 1, they visually saw them wearing their seatbelts over their lap. Believing to have visually confirmed the presence of the involved rider's seatbelt over their lap, Operator 1 tightened their seatbelts by pulling on the tails of the seatbelt near the buckle and restraint block. Operator 1 then turned their attention to the next seat and, without noticing, dropped the tails of the involved rider's seatbelts between their right leg and the edge of the seat. Operator 1 continued verifying restraints on the remaining seats, then gave the safety spiel while facing all 6 riders. Operator 1 then returned to the operator booth. The restraint indicators on the HMI screen displayed red on the 3P indicator in the restraint cycled section. Operator 1 assumed this to be due to the common restraint condition. Operator 1 returned to the ride unit. Because Operator 1 believed the involved rider to be wearing the seatbelt from their previous verification, their focused attention was on the restraint block, which was below the seat, and not the position of their seatbelt. Operator 1 pushed and pulled on the restraint pins for seats 5, 4, 3, and 2, then returned to the operator booth and found the 3P restraint cycled indicator still red. Operator 1 returned to the ride unit again and pushed and pulled on the restraint pins for seats 1, 2, and 3, then returned to the operator booth to find the 3P restraint cycled indicator still red. Operator 1 returned to the ride unit again and pushed and pulled on each of the 6 restraint pins, then returned to the operator booth to find that the 3P restraint cycled indicator was still red. Operator 1 has now returned to the ride unit 3 times over the course of 1 minute and 4 seconds. At this point, Operator 2 returns from their rest break and enters the operator booth via the exterior door. Operator 1 explains the situation and points out the red 3P indicator on the HMI screen and that they have already pushed and pulled on all of the restraint pins multiple times. Operator 2 believes the indicator light is due to the common restraint condition and uses the restraint selector switch to unlock all 6 restraint pins. Operator 2 then goes to the ride unit and proceeds to remove all 6 restraint pins from the restraint blocks and lets them hang off the side of each seat next to the restraint block. By removing the pin from the restraint block on seat 3, the 3P restraint cycled indicator light on the HMI screen turned green, as the sensor monitoring the presence of the restraint pin had now been cycled. Operator 2 then signaled to Operator 1 to turn the restraint selector switch back to the locked position. Once the restraint blocks had been relocked, Operator 2 begins reinserting and verifying the restraint pins for seats 1 and 2. Operator 1 then returned to the ride unit and reinserted the restraint pins for seats 6, 5, and 4, then returned to the operator booth. Operator 2 reached seat 3, the involved rider's seat, and reinserted the restraint pin and pulled on the tail. Operator 1 communicates from the operator booth that all restraint indicators are now green to Operator 2. After Operator 2 finishes verifying seat 3, the involved rider again takes the 36-inch tails of the seatbelts and puts them over their lap. Operator 2 stands in front of the ride unit and gives one last look at all 6 riders, who all appear to have seatbelts over their laps. Operator 2 returns to the operator booth, closes and locks the door, and dispatches the ride. The ride begins, and the involved rider, not secured under any seatbelts, falls to the bottom of the shaft and is fatally injured. With the power of hindsight, all accidents can be avoided. This accident was the result of several failures by several different parties, all lining up in just the right way. Had Soaring Eagle changed the design of their seatbelts to retractable seatbelts with brightly colored webbing, this could have been avoided. Had Glenwood Caverns properly received and responded to the email sent to them in 2019, this accident could have been avoided. Had either the manufacturer's manual or Glenwood's SOP and training made any mention to the possibility of a rider sitting on top of a seatbelt and taken steps to prevent it, this accident could have been avoided. I can go on and on. The point being that no accident has a single cause, and this one is no different. Haunted Mine Drop, in its original form, was closed forever following this accident. The accident did spark some significant changes that we'll now be covering next. Starting off with Soaring Eagles / Altitude Attractions. They issued a non-mandatory service bulletin recommending switching all of their existing rides to brightly colored seatbelts. They still produce zipline rides and drop towers that are still advertised as featuring the exact same restraint design as what was found on Haunted Mine Drop, black webbing and all. It was not until after the accident that the previous accidents on the Soaring Eagle rides were discovered, and the company still has not implemented any of the changes recommended by engineers now over 10 years ago. Glenwood Caverns training procedures and content were found to be very lacking, contributing to the accident. As a result, they overhauled their training program, bringing in the third-party auditing company IRT to give them guidance and insights on their operation. Additionally, they overhauled their training, rewriting SOPs to contain significantly more detail about everything that an operator may be expected to encounter when operating a ride at the park. The original SOP for Haunted Mine Drop was notoriously only 3 pages long. The new SOP for the ride that replaced it is now over 40 pages long and features extensive warnings about how riders could accidentally misuse their restraints. While Haunted Mine Drop was closed, Glenwood Caverns reached out to a third-party engineering firm called Apollo Engineering. Apollo had experience redesigning aspects of other rides for the park in the past. Glenwood Caverns would now work with them to create a much more human-friendly version of the Haunted Mine Drop that reused parts of the original ride. The new ride, called Crystal Tower, opened in 2023. It featured many changes that addressed flaws in the original design. First, the layout of the queue room was changed to allow riders to have a view of the ride and for operators to pre-screen and group riders. The operator booth was relocated to have a direct view of the ride room, and now requires 2 operators instead of 1. On the ride unit, a cage was added to make evacuation situations easier, as well as to add a last line of defense if a seatbelt was ever not secure. The seatbelts were changed from 2 black non-retractable seatbelts to 1 retractable orange-colored 3-point seatbelt. This seatbelt locks in place on the receiver and cannot be undone by the rider when it's locked. This allows for better visibility for operators as well as better ease of use for riders, as it's now similar to an average car seatbelt. In Glenwood's own testing, it is much easier to tell when a rider is sitting on top of this seatbelt, even when compared to a brightly colored version of a lap belt. The ride was also changed so that at the end of a ride cycle, all restraints now unlock and remain unlocked until all seatbelts are removed from their receivers. They then automatically relock after all being removed. Many of these changes had other benefits too, such as increased efficiency. Additionally, there were several more changes made to the ride that are outside the scope of this video, but may be covered in their own video in the future. Lastly, this accident has had an impact on the wider industry. Glenwood Caverns is very open about wanting to get the entire story of this accident out there so that others can learn. That is why IAAPA and Glenwood Caverns reached out to me to provide a visual representation of the accident that was shown at the Ames International Safety Seminar to nearly 800 of the top safety experts in the amusement industry, and will be shown again at several more industry safety conferences over the next few months. All with the goal of ensuring that others do not repeat the same mistakes that caused this accident. For that, they have had an impact on the wider industry as a whole. Hopefully, the lessons from this terrible accident were not learned in vain, and many more accidents will be prevented as a result. To conclude this section of the video, I wanted to display this message from Glenwood Caverns General Manager Nancy Hurd regarding her takeaways from the accident, speaking to an audience of safety professionals.
Hello, I am Nancy Hurd, General Manager of Glenwood Caverns Adventure Park, where the tragic accident occurred on the Haunted Mine Drop in 2021. This has been incredibly difficult for us. Like many of you, we have dedicated our careers to amusement ride safety. The impact of this accident has been life-changing for us, both personally and professionally. While it is painful to speak about, we believe it is critically important to do so. It is important to us to share the learnings with the industry in the hope of preventing this or similar accidents from ever happening again. To dismiss this simply as operator error would be regrettable. I implore you to take all the learnings of this accident so that you do not have to experience this yourself. We want to express how deeply saddened we are and acknowledge the unimaginable pain that this accident has caused the family. A family came into our park that day and left without their 6-year-old daughter. Think about that. A family came into our park that day and left without their 6-year-old daughter. That loss has left a hole in their hearts that can never be filled, and we carry that reality with us every day. Thank you for listening, and thank you for your commitment to safety.
While Glenwood Caverns did help with gathering information on this video, the content of this video has been made as neutral as possible. In addition to speaking with representatives from Glenwood Caverns, I've also heard from representatives with Altitude and IAAPA. Additionally, I have every source for this video, including the report on the previous Soaring Eagle ejection, as well as the state accident report and the manuals for the ride linked below. I encourage anyone interested in learning more to read these documents, and to reach out to me if any new information becomes available. I take the accuracy of these videos very seriously and will make updates if new information comes to light. As a reminder, not only is all of the source material for this video on my website, but so are every accident report that I've ever used in a video, as well as several others that I've not used, at least not yet. All of these can be great resources when understanding amusement ride safety. It's important to keep in mind that amusement rides remain incredibly safe. Statistically far safer per rider than even extremely safety conscious industries such as air travel. That being said, studying the few accidents that have occurred and taking steps to prevent similar situations makes the entire industry safer. Whether you are in this industry or just someone who's interested in it and watching this video, you are helping to contribute to that process. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.